Is your magic meter running low? Well, we've got a cure for you. Welcome to Disney Coast to Coast.
Hey folks, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast, the ultimate unofficial Disney fan podcast. I'm Jeff DePauli, and today on the show, I have cross-platform communicator Jeff Kurtti joining me to discuss the various aspects of his Disney career. Jeff has authored over 40 books for Disney, produced numerous documentaries, and even helped with the launch of the Walt Disney Family Museum. I had a great time chatting with Jeff about his many projects, as well as his overall thoughts about Disney as a brand. It's all coming your way right after this. Right now, over at DisneyCoastToCoast.com, you can get your hands on 5 exclusive compilation episodes of Disney Coast to Coast that you won't hear anywhere else. That's right, 5 episodes, and they all include exclusive interviews with Disney legends and talents crossing decades of Walt Disney Company history. The 5 compilation episodes include Beauty and the Beast, Screen to Stage to Screen, featuring interviews about Beauty and the Beast starting as an animated feature, then heading to the Broadway stage, and then back to the big screen as a live-action film. Then there's Tower of Terror, Behind the Fifth Dimension, taking you behind the scenes of the ride and Wonderful World of Disney movie, Conversations with Disney Legends, which is pretty self-explanatory, Lending Their Voices, featuring conversations with a bunch of different Disney voiceover artists, and Art as a Craft, discussing the craft of making art with Disney artists. You can get all 5 of these compilation episodes by visiting DisneyCoastToCoast.com/exclusive, or simply by visiting DisneyCoastToCoast.com and clicking on Exclusive in the main menu. Write it down right now so you don't forget and miss out on these exclusive episodes you won't find in your podcast feed. They're all at DisneyCoastToCoast.com/exclusive.
Prepare for some insight. You've tuned in to an exclusive DCTC interview.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I very much appreciate it. Welcome to Disney Coast to Coast.
Other Jeff, I'm glad to be asked. I'm always glad when people want to just listen to me yak.
We're going to be hopping all over the place because as I look over your career with Disney stuff, it is all over the place. So forgive me if the timeline jumps all around. I want to start with, you're described as a cross-platform communicator. And I want to know, was this a title you made up for yourself or that somebody gave you, and what exactly does it mean?
What it means is that I have, and my fundamental professional role over decades has really been that of a kind of storyteller, a communicator. But I use all different media, and I've done everything from hosting and moderating panel discussions to doing presentations to producing, writing, and directing documentary material, to writing books, to whatever the communication platform that was available. I have used it to communicate the stories that I tell. It sounds kind of groovy on a LinkedIn page too.
It does sound very good. It's very it's like a Renaissance man kind of, yeah?
Well, I had worked as a consultant for an old pal of mine who does placemaking and exhibit design, theme park attractions, and so on. And he called me his favorite polymath. And I smiled and nodded and thought that was a very sweet thing. And then I immediately ran over to my phone and looked up what a polymath is. But basically what he was saying is, there's a phrase, jack of all trades and master of none,
yes,
which is typically used as a pejorative. It's usually used sort of in a negative way, but there's a full quote that goes with that, and it's actually meant in a positive way. It means someone who has capabilities or knowledge across a variety of skill sets. And the quote is actually, jack of all trades, master of none, oftentimes better than master one.
Oh, I love that because I very much put myself in that camp of, jack of all trades, master of none, and I've been told that as well. So I love the second part of that quote.
And you never hear the second part of that quote, and that's unfortunate because it really is a compliment. And what it means is that you can carry your skill sets across a variety of responsibilities. It's not good for HR. When you're
Yeah.
interviewing for things or you're discussing professional responsibilities, I tend to short circuit the sort of standard HR mind. I really need to get with people who have sort of a more breadth of a creative background and understand what that polymath skill set can do. But yeah, that's my fancy way of describing that I am that a jack of all trades and master of none.
I love that. And frankly, I think it's why a lot of people in that position end up creating their own jobs, I think. Because like you said, it's hard to sell yourself when you're, doing all these different things. I think so. I think a lot of these people create their own companies. Heck, Walt was one, right?
Well, exactly. And the other thing is, I think personally, you get into a situation where, I'm fortunate. Frequently, I'm given roles where they want that. They want that polymath point of view. But it's horrible sometimes to get into a role where they want you to sort of stay in that box, and your tendency is always to be thinking outside of it. So it can be frustrating on that level too, not just from people who want to quantify you and describe you sort of, here's your one sentence cut line, but it's also from a personal standpoint can be frustrating because you always want to do more.
Now, was entertainment industry always the goal for you? Did that start as a young kid, or how did you end up in this crazy industry?
The legend of Jeff Kurtti, as those people who have heard me interviewed before will remember, is that when I was about 5 years old or so, my mom took me to see Mary Poppins
Yeah.
at the Mount Baker Theater in Bellingham, Washington. And I am told that I sat still for 2 hours and 20 minutes, which I had never done before. And the first thing that I said afterwards is, can we see it again? I had always liked, I was a coloring book kid. I liked to draw. I loved my records. I liked watching TV. I was not a sporto. I was not interested in a baseball or a football or a sports ball of any kind. And Mary Poppins, as I often say, broke my brain. And from that point on, my grandmother is the one who made me aware that Walt Disney's Mary Poppins, that Walt Disney was a guy. Because, I was, 5 or 6 years old, and I was like, Walt Disney meant as much to me as Betty Crocker. It was just a thing. So she explained to me that Walt Disney was this man and who he was and what he had done. And of course, since the womb, I've been a Mickey guy. Mickey's my guy. Mickey is my spirit animal?
Yes, there we go.
Does Mickey qualify as a Horcrux of some kind? I don't know. Mickey, and when she told me that Walt Disney was Mickey Mouse, and that story, holy smokes! So I digested everything. I've always been a little bit of a terrier. I run out and dig and look for stuff. So that became my hobby. That was the thing I did after school or in school. I would go to the library and look in encyclopedias and look up Disneyland and look up Walt Disney. And I would look on the shelves for books that were the basis of Disney movies. So I would read Blackbeard's Ghost, or I would read Follow Me Boys, those kinds of things that had a connection to Disney. And I think a lot of fans actually sort of still do that. Disney is a doorway into finding out about other things. So that was very much me when I was a kid. I loved my 3 record albums of childhood were the soundtrack of Mary Poppins, the soundtrack of Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and the soundtrack of Tom Sawyer. So I was already a Sherman Brothers aficionado.
I was going to say, you got the Sherman Brothers history already before you even started working on that stuff.
So yeah, it's always been a part of my personal culture and my identity.
I love that moment when people realize that the name Walt Disney refers to a man, an amazing man, and it's why I get really frustrated when I see the name Walt taken off of certain things, and it just becomes Disney, this corporate name sort of thing. So to me, I love being in the parks and seeing kids, see the partner statue and ask that question, who is that? And it's so important to me. And I love the story of your first recognition of that. And I think it may have been the partner statue for me that really kind of tipped me off. I don't know. I definitely read books about him as a kid as well. I don't remember the specific moment, to be honest, but I know that it's a moment I think that every kid has at some point in his life, and it's so cool.
It's an interesting epiphany, and you just revealed, of course, that I'm really old and you're really young. So, that's basically our difference in that. It's the last conversation I had with John Hench. John Hench was he was a polymath. He really was a jack of all trades for Walt. And he did a whole ton of things, from animation artists. He was sort of a right-hand guy to Walt in the animation area, came over to Imagineering. He was an extraordinary color stylist. And John also was an extraordinary philosopher. John was in his 90s and still working when he passed away. And I had gone over to see him right towards the end of his life for an interview for a book I was working on or something. So John and I spent about 20 minutes talking about what I needed for the book. And he and I had known each other over my whole Disney career. I'd worked at WDI and stuff. So I'm talking, and we got into this conversation. He was endlessly fascinated by Mickey and the sort of universal attractiveness of Mickey and the design of Mickey, and why did people react to the way Mickey looked. And it led us down this philosophical pathway to him asking me, when did my Disney fan switch get flipped? So I told him the story I just told you about Mary Poppins, and he got very quiet and he pondered and he said, I'm just convinced that there's something in some people. Maybe it's genetic, but you become a Disney fan. There's just a switch that turns on at some point, and some people have it and some people don't. So it was interesting to hear somebody with I think he was almost 60 years, just shy of 60 years with the company, still thinking about and wondering about what is it that makes people plug in to the whole Disney culture. Fascinating, endlessly fascinating.
The thing that I find so fascinating about the Disney fandom is that it's not a fandom, it's a lifestyle in so many cases. And as many things there are out there that have a solid fan base, to create a lifestyle surrounding that is much more rare, I think. So it's very interesting when I see that.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I did a presentation of a sort of a tour and stuff at Disneyland with a group of young influencers last spring down at Disneyland. And so I wound up, I had worked it out so that there was a group of about 12. So we split in half, and half of them got a tour of Walt's apartment on Main Street, and the other half had to sit and listen to me babble for half an hour. But we got into talking about that, and I said to them, because they had gotten into talking about things that have to do with the company, capital C company. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, unless you're a big fan of corporate America or business, you don't care about the company. Why should you care? And they looked at me puzzled, and I said, Disney is a thing, and the company is this other thing. I said, think about it this way. Here's your church, and you go every Sunday, and you listen to the sermon, and you share the fellowship, and you sing the hymns. Over here in Vatican City is the Pope and the College of the Cardinals. And what do you care what they're doing? Because their vested interest is to keep your church open and active and alive. So I find that a lot of fans, on one hand, get very focused on stock prices and stuff that I really, that's not my interest. And then the other side is then they have a recognition of, oh, yes, this is sort of a religion, as you said, a lifestyle. And yes, what I need to focus on is sharing the good news and enjoying the fellowship. And I think that's another thing that's distinctive to me. We've gotten into some conversations over the last couple months with colleagues. One of the most interesting things about the Disney fan culture is it's a culture that I think is primarily based on sharing. You get into a lot of fan cultures and it's about collecting or ownership issues of some kind, whether it's intellectual ownership or I'm the expert on the first season of, the Planet of the Apes TV show. That is my thing. It's an ownership. I don't meet a lot of Disney fans that are like that because, to tell you the truth, I don't think they survive in our collective fandom because people don't want to play that game in the Disney fandom. I think people who are deeply invested in the Disney culture find that a lot of its great gratification is telling other people about it and getting them interested in that movie, or let me tell you the story that I know about that theme park attraction, or do you know why that's painted that color? It becomes a sort of a campfire storytelling activity almost in that sense. So I think that's very, very much differentiates the Disney fan from of other fan communities.
Yeah, it is definitely a passionate group of people, for sure. People making podcasts and YouTube channels and such all about it.
But look, what are you doing?
Sharing information.
You're going, hey, I can talk to this guy, and the guys who listen to my podcast will really dig this. I mean, to me, that's like a really pure motivation about why you love and appreciate something is so you can share it.
I mean, there's nothing more fun, I think, than initially falling in love with something and then sharing it with people so that they can have that same feeling. Like I think that's one of the most fun things in the world. Or, if it's a movie or a ride or whatever, it's like, oh my God, I love that. I want everybody on earth to love that. And, I always go back to this example, but there are many people who have written in to the podcast to tell me that they watched Honey, I Shrunk the Kids for the first time or introduced it to their kids or whatever, just because I am so insanely passionate about that film. And I love the fact that they check it out and, in most cases really love it. And I think that's awesome.
I had a colleague many years ago who would see something glorious or a beautiful sunset or a spectacular piece of art, and he would just look at it and go, regardez, which at its most simple it's French for, basically look at that, regardez. But the way that he said it and what he really meant was, I am appreciating this and you should too. And I think that's a lot of that. There are those moments with Disney where you put your arm around someone and say, regardez, this is beautiful. Share this with me. And you're right. I sent somebody, gosh, I'm always getting asked by people to sort of recommend or to point them. And I got asked a question on an interview not too long ago about music. And I said, well, the thing that's out there that wasn't for a long time is the score to Island at the Top of the World, which is by Maurice Jarre, who is a famous cinematic composer. I think it might be his only Disney score. And, who knows that stuff except some deep-seated nerds? And it's our job to point people and say, hey, do you know Maurice Jarre did a Disney score and it's not bad?
I am not familiar with that music at all, so I'm going to have to go check that one out.
It's got a funny thing. It's got a funny little feel to it, and you can kind of like hear a little Lawrence of Arabia creep into it. It's a little strange, but it's got that sort of grandeur to it, a lot of that sort of majestic, because of course it was sort of a Disney science fantasy epic of the 1970s, so not a terribly good movie, but I love it. I like a lot of movies that aren't good, so that's my thing.
Nice. Well, let's get into you, because you have done a ton of work for Disney. I'm going to start with some of the writing that you've done.
Okay.
And do you happen to remember I'm sure you do, I'm sure it was a great day. What was the first book that you actually wrote for the Walt Disney Company?
I got a call from Wendy Lefcon, who was an new editor at Hyperion. She had actually come over from doing the Birnbaum guides back in the mid-90s, and she had been brought over to Hyperion as an editor to focus on their Disney titles. And she and I had met in my last days working in Disney corporate before I left the company in 1995. And I just liked her. And so the first thing I did was sat down and sent her, I think, a 4-page memo of book ideas. And I left the company on April 1st of 1995 after 10 years and went freelance. Like you said earlier, I went and invented my own job. Wendy reached out to me and said, "Are you interested, in doing there's no book about Walt Disney World. And it's the 25th anniversary. Now, of course,
I have that book on my shelf.
Next year is the 50th anniversary. So once again, I'm old. But she said, there were 25th anniversaries coming up. Do you want to do a Walt Disney World book? Because there isn't one. And that was my first Disney book, was Since the World Began, the 25th anniversary book for Walt Disney World. And, I was terrified. Because,
that's a fun project, though. I mean...
Oh, it's a terribly fun project, terribly intimidating. I had never done anything like that.
3 parks at the time.
Well, we got up to doing at the end a preview of the cruise line, a preview of Wide World of Sports, a preview of... Animal Kingdom is chapter 7, and it hadn't opened yet. So, and a lot of this I didn't know. I didn't know how to do this. And, of course, it was... talk about ancient history. This is the old days. There was you didn't send emails or have online research and stuff. I had to go to research facilities and Walt Disney Archives and Walt Disney Imagineering Research Center. And I had to go and look through slides at the Walt Disney Imagineering Art Collection, So in those days, it was, number one, I hadn't filled in a learning curve on my Disney that I have now over the last 25 years. But also things are much more available now, and it's much easier to find the credible and authoritative research. But I also, over those years, have met a lot more people that I can reach out to, and silly things like, I have this picture from Epcot, and who are these 5 people? That was a big book for my first Disney book. That was a big, and you know what? It was a leap of faith for Wendy Lefcon, bless her heart. She's still my senior editor. I just talked to her on the phone yesterday for about an hour. We're friends and colleagues, and she and I were talking because I had just gotten a correspondence from the Walt Disney Archives that said that they had sort of finally put together the statistics, and that I have the record for the most nonfiction Disney books authored by one person. So he says, it looks like our current book count for you is 44, which includes second and third editions of the same title, as well as re-releases, like The Art of Mulan came out again this year, a 20th anniversary edition. So we did a little primping and polishing to that. So that was it. 25 years ago, started with that.
Yeah, I was looking through that book yesterday, and as I was looking over the introduction again, not to put age on this or anything, but I was reading something in the introduction that I honestly had never really thought of before, even though I knew it obviously existed at one point. And you write about that anticipation for the opening of Walt Disney World, and I had honestly never really thought about that. It was, over a decade before I was born. And so it's just always been part of my life. And like something that big, I anticipate a lot of things. I get very excited about a lot of things, but I don't think I'd ever anticipated anything on that large of a scale in this country or in my interests and stuff. And I don't know, can you touch on that a bit? Because I know it took quite a few years later for you to get there.
I grew up in a very different time. I'm a kid of the 60s and 70s. I was born in 1961. So I grew up in a household with a telephone that was attached to the wall with a wire. The television got 3 national networks and 2 local channels. A computer was something we saw in science fiction movies or in Desk Set with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. The world was smaller. The communication world, you had anticipation for movies opening. I keep thinking I went to see Star Wars 17 times the summer it came out, me and my best buddy from high school. 17 times waiting in a line for hours outside. It was just a whole different kind of culture. So what that meant in a lot of ways is for a company like Disney, it was much easier to manage that anticipation, build it, create messaging sequences that really whet your appetite for things. So you would get the Walt Disney Wonderful World of Disney magazine from your local Gulf station. They used to do a premium magazine through Gulf stations, and Gulf was one of the first big sponsors of Walt Disney World. And they would have articles about the making of Destination Resort, this vacation kingdom. Or you would watch the Sunday night TV show and they would have a minute-long preview at a certain point in the show, beating the drum for Walt Disney World. You'd get the comic books at the drugstore and they'd have a little logo on them of Walt Disney World or Disney's 50th anniversary. And I subscribed to a thing that was called Disney News Magazine, which was done through the Magic Kingdom Club, which was a sort of a member program. And they had a quarterly magazine that was just all full of what's going on at Disney. I mean, I was in hog heaven with stuff like that.
So it's D23 before D23 existed.
Oh, yeah. And in an interesting era at Disney, too, because they were just moving into when I started getting Disney news, it was the summer of 1971. So I was 10 years old. So I was 9 years old. That's the thing. I look over there and there's my binder file boxes with 100-year-old copies of Disney news that I still make reference to and pull quotes from and stuff. So that sense of anticipating, sometimes it's not knowing that builds that sense of anticipation. So you see renderings, you see photographs, you see a magazine article, you see a feature in the Sunday newspaper, and it builds these pieces like a jigsaw puzzle. But you don't really know what it is until that thing is ready to open up. And they do the big hour-long network TV special with Julie Andrews hosting the grand opening of Walt Disney World. And of course, I sat like a transfixed religious zealot watching her dancing up and down this giant Main Street USA, and so clean and pristine and brand new. And it was remarkable. I mean, it's a whole sort of the sense of an event culture. We now have hundreds of thousands every day of uncurated messages going out into our psyche. There's a commentator that I listened to said he actually thinks that attention deficit disorder has much more to do with the fact that people are getting inundated with uncurated stimulus. They're not being shown how to arrange or process information that they're receiving. That's why we have all of this fallout on social media all the time, and all of this hostility and anger is because people are receiving uncurated information, accepting things as truth that are not truth, dismissing things that are true as fake news or lies or hoaxes. Even 25 years ago, the curation of information was much more careful.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and what you're describing of, the Walt Disney Company or whomever being able to paint this picture and build the anticipation the way that they want to build it, that's something I did grow up with. And frankly, I miss it. And, it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and, the last 10, 15 years that social media has become this thing where I feel like companies don't have the control that they once did because there's constantly leaked information and rumors and all this stuff. So these companies are kind of forced to sometimes make announcements of things. I find this especially true with Disney. Mm-hmm. And they're forced to make announcements about things that they're really not ready to announce just because they want to make sure that they say it before it's leaked. So, for example, I know Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, there were, some quote-unquote promises made by the company that didn't come to realization. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, if this was 20, 30 years ago, we would have never been told about X, Y, or Z. we would have found out about it the day it opens, and if it wasn't there, we wouldn't have missed it because we would have never heard about it.
Well, the other thing I think that you can really, you'll understand as a communicator out in this world. Let me give you an example, and I was talking to one of the company executives about this. The blowback that happened when Galaxy's Edge was announced for Disneyland, and part of that plan included components of that project that were not built for a variety of reasons. And part of that announcement had to do with the rerouting of the railroad tracks and the rerouting of the rivers of America. And the fan community went insane. I don't know if I'm making a really out-of-date reference. There was this book called Don't Move My Cheese, which was basically about interrupting people's sense of order. It was sort of like a pop psychology book, as I recall. But I have a friend who always says, oh, don't move their Disney cheese. It has to do with people having a specific sensibility about the order that exists in the universe and not coping well with unexpected change. So I told this Disney executive that I was talking to, what's interesting to me is back in about 1976, they bulldozed half of Frontierland and an attraction that Walt Disney had fundamentally outlined himself.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody was really any the wiser or cared that much, because at the same time they announced the wildest ride in the wilderness. It was going to be Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, and it's a whole new thing. And, it's a different... Back in those days, it was, well, what are those crazy geniuses at Disney going to do now? And now it's, you're moving my Disney cheese. That's not my, there are still way too many people that think that the malleability of a Disney park is somehow a new idea. I found a quotation from years ago where Walt was basically making the case that when he sent a movie off to be processed, it was done. But the thing with Disneyland that he loved was it was a canvas. And if he didn't like it, he could paint over it. Yeah. Or, and this is critical because you get a fan positioning a lot of times that Walt Disney was a pure, sterile genius whose every thought and whim was sacrosanct. But Walt himself would say, sometimes the audience comes back to me and says, I didn't like this, or why didn't you do that? And with a movie, I'm stuck. I can't do anything about it. But with a park, I can listen to my guests. So it's a different way, I think, that fans interpret what they see from Disney. They see something announced that doesn't get built quite exactly as it was announced, as a promise broken.
Plus, there's just like Twitter accounts and stuff keeping tabs on literally this sign changed today, or there's a bench in a new location, and stuff like that.
And the ones who dog the patent office and the permit offices, And,
oh, yeah.
Yes. So there's a level of, shall we say, enthusiasm.
It's a very nice word to say.
It is interesting.
Yes, agreed. It very much is. And, it's as annoying as it can be for the company, it's also quite a badge of honor that people literally care enough to know if you've moved a bench or, so it goes both ways.
I do a lot of consulting with Disney, a lot of stuff about legacy and culture. And of course, that is the core of a company. And I say, once again, capital C company over here. But what its relationship to is the culture over here. So the one depends on the other. And with Disney, you have an extraordinarily strong culture and legacy that the company leans into constantly for its values, for core concepts, for key ideas. The part of the reason they're able to do that is because their audience feels so proprietary. Everybody has an ownership stake in the culture of Disney. They're cultural shareholders. And Disney has to answer to the cultural shareholders just as much as they have to the New York Stock Exchange shareholders. That's a great value. The downside of that is that proprietary nature of the Disney culture makes it really tough sometimes for Disney to move a bench or to seal off a doorway, because everybody has a personal experience with a Disney movie, a park, a Disney event, a Disney something. That's why they embrace Disney, because it's attached to emotional resonances. So people put their arms around Disney as a culture. So once again, the company is very skilled and extraordinarily cautious about the fragility of that contract with the company's culture and legacy and the guest, the consumer, the Disney fan. Fascinating stuff to me.
You've sparked a question for me, and I apologize because this was supposed to be an interview about all of your work, but we've gone on Disney philosophy here, and I've got to ask, it is very interesting to me how in some cases, like you were saying, the Walt Disney Company does lean into Walt Disney in a way that, like, most companies don't. People don't know who Carl Laemmle is over at Universal. 99% of people don't. But a lot of people know who Walt Disney is. And the company does recognize that and does do things to honor him, like put a partner statue and many, many other things. But then at the same time, I see them do things like take the name Walt Disney off of Walt Disney Pictures and just make it Disney. And to me, they're going in such opposite directions that it confuses me.
We had, when I was in Disney corporate, I was in a very interesting corporate marketing role called corporate synergy and special projects. And a lot of that had to do with company culture. We always had a sort of rule of thumb, which was if Walt was involved with it personally, it was Walt Disney's. We're talking about film mainly here, or TV. Or if you were talking about a film that was made after Walt's passing that did not involve him as a creative entity, it was Walt Disney Productions, later Walt Disney Pictures. There's a certain logic to a Disney brand that is not attached to Walt Disney's personal identity. And I understand it. I get that there's a logic there to that. Because ultimately, Walt himself said it, I'm not Walt Disney anymore. All of this is. So he even knew in his lifetime that it had grown beyond that. So I actually think there's a certain amount of care that has gone with a branding strategy. The thing that I thought was kind of peculiar was given this is just my opinion as an observer and nerd, and it's not a terrible thing, it's just a different way of doing it. Given what we've talked about how people feel proprietary about Disney and how their ownership stake is important to them, it was the apostrophe S coming off that I looked at and thought, well, that's odd, because you kind of want that possessive, that it's Disney's thing. Mm-hmm. But that was a decision that was made for, I'm not in those rooms. I was just telling somebody yesterday, even when I worked in corporate, there was stuff going on the 6th floor above my head that I had no idea about. So who knows what goes on in those decisions. But I thought there was, in some cases, there was a really bad tendency at a certain time to sort of slap Walt on things as sort of an endorsement from beyond the grave, or to treat Walt like a character. I was involved at the time that a lot of this was happening with Walt Disney's family, with his daughter and Diane Disney Miller and Walt's son-in-law Ron Miller and the grandchildren of the Disney family. And I just I was doing some liaison work with the company on their behalf. And I talked to the company about that, and that everybody needs to keep in mind that this was a real person. This is a man who's only a generation away. He's not ancient history. And to a lot of people, he's dad, he's grandpa, he's Uncle Walt. He's the guy I worked with for 25 years at the studio. The other thing is you hurt people's feelings. People who knew him, who loved him, who had lunch with him, who sat in his backyard. So try not to treat him like KFC treats Colonel Sanders. And what's really lovely is, fortunately for us, there's a whole lot of real smart people who work at Disney. And everybody sort of got that and went, oh yeah, I'm in my late 20s and I don't have that connection. I didn't grow up watching him on TV every Sunday night.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been lucky enough to interview a bunch of people who worked with Walt or knew Walt and such. And even somebody like myself who has studied Walt for a very, very long time. He was gone long before I was born, yet I am well aware that this was a man, but it's still always interesting to hear people who knew him or sit down with those people and have conversations, because it's kind of like, oh yeah, even for me, it's kind of a reminder, so.
It's very easy. It's very easy because since his passing, he has been deified and mythologized. And that was one of the things that led Diane Disney Miller to create the Walt Disney Family Museum. And that was one of her key irritants, I think, was it's not so much the sort of iconoclastic Walt Disney was evil, Walt Disney was an anti-Semite, Walt Disney was a sexist, all of the typical BS that comes out that's, number one, so false, and number two, so easily disproven. But on the other side of that coin, Diane was a little frightened by the deification of her dad. And if you look at that philosophically, either one of those extremes is undesirable, because part of what made Walt Disney interesting was his very humanity. And it is very easy, based on this perception of him, either for good or ill, to kind of forget that he was a guy who got up in the morning and shaved and, got in his car and drove to work and, didn't like what he had for lunch. And that was one of our key goals with the Walt Disney Family Museum, was to humanize his story to the degree that people would have an emotional reaction to and an understanding emotionally of who he was and what he did.
Emotional is the right word, because when I went to that museum, it's an emotional roller coaster for sure. And I should mention that you were creative director, content consultant, and media producer for the museum. And was that you had left the Walt Disney Company at least full time by that
I had
point?
left and gone consulting. So I was doing books. I was working on a lot of Walt Disney Home Video stuff. I did a lot of the supplement and bonus material for the DVD editions when Disney first got into the DVD market, because I had tagged on to the last few Laserdisc editions that they had done. And that's where they established the whole notion of supplemental content. So I was doing lots of freelance and consulting work, writing, producing, and directing historical, documentary, legacy content. So it was about 10 years after. It was when my oldest son was born, so 2005. I got a call from Walter Elias Disney Miller, who is Walt's grandson. And he's about exactly my age. And he said, I have a project my mom and I have been working on. Had 3 different people today tell me that I really should get to know you. So Walter Miller and his mom, Diane Disney Miller, Walt's daughter, came to my house and sat at my dining room table and talked to me about their idea for a museum. And I tried to pay attention and to be smart and clever and present. But there was this 6-year-old kid inside my brain going, that's Walt Disney's daughter, and that's Walt Disney's grandson. So based on that meeting, I came on board, and I had 4 different roles in the creation of the museum, and worked with the Walt Disney family for, ultimately it was about a 10-year stint until just a few years ago. But I was the creative director, content consultant, the media producer, and I think, to tell you the truth, maybe the core thing that I did was helped to reestablish a relationship between the family and the company, which had been torpedoed in about 1983, 84. I think that was one of the most satisfying things about that whole project, was that it built a bridge.
I know that the company doesn't run the museum, but how involved are they with the museum as far, was archives involved and stuff?
Oh, gosh, yes. The core of the Walt Disney Family Museum is all Walt Disney's name, signature, likeness, voice, all of that is owned by the Walt Disney Company. That was sold to the corporate entity in 1983 by the family. In putting together the exhibits and the materials and the media, all of that footage of Walt Disney, all of the on-camera interviews, all of the recordings, photographs, etc., except for those very personal family photographs, are owned by the Disney Company. So it was imperative. And when we had that first meeting, I said to Diane and Walter, who is your contact at the company? And they were still very bristly about the company. And I said, well, here's the dilemma. The company will have to license, at that point, I said, probably 75% of what we put on display, as well as the use of the name Walt Disney.
Was there any, was the company pretty receptive to the idea of the museum, or was there some convincing that needed to take place?
At the time, there was a vice president in corporate synergy and special projects, my old department, terrific guy who's at Pixar now and has been at Pixar for a long time, named Jonathan Garson. And Michael Eisner was still CEO at the time. This was 2005. I went to Jonathan Garson and I just gave him sort of a sit at your desk pitch. I'd known Jonathan for ages and we were good pals. And I said, look, the family wants to do this museum. So he said, write me up a brief, write me up something that I can hand off if I need to. So I wrote a fundamental description of the project, took it to Jonathan. We went through it. He took it to Michael and said, why would we not do this?
Michael said that. Michael Eisner?
Eisner said, why would we not do this?
I'm so happy to hear that. I love Michael Eisner, so it's great.
Disney has been blessed by some pretty strong leadership because, Michael was basically my big boss when I was in my corporate role. And I worked in a department that he started because he thought that core synergy with the company's cultural strengths was important enough to have a department to look after it. So I admire Michael a lot, and he's always been super nice to me. And I ran into him at a memorial service, actually, not too long ago. And I hadn't seen Michael in 100 years. And I walked up and said, hi, Michael, I'm sure you don't remember me. I used to work for you. And he says, hi, Jeff, how have you been? Michael was behind it. He said, basically, Jonathan, take it on as a special project. Jonathan liked it because I wasn't terribly demanding. I kind of knew what we wanted. Mm-hmm. And of course, based on my years doing books and documentaries and stuff, I kind of knew where everything was. So yeah. I knew what was in the photo library, what's in the animation research library, who are the contacts there, what are their procedures to do acquisitions and loans. I worked with the attorney for the family, the Disney family, to help set up the licensing agreement between the museum and the company.
So does the museum have to pay the company to use Walt's name and likeness and all that stuff?
No. They don't pay them, but it's licensed. It's an unpaid license.
Gotcha.
But basically, the company has to track all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So the company, for instance, throughout the museum, we use elements of films and music. Well, a lot of those film clips, the post-1960 Disney films that we address, they have to be approved, and if there's any royalties due for the clip use, that has to be paid to the Directors Guild, to the Screen Actors Guild. Music cues, music is music. You've got to clear it. And that was one of the odd jobs I'd never done before that I wound up doing, was I did all of the music cue clearances, working with the music department at Disney. So a lot of it is about tracking intellectual property and making sure that it's properly compensated to those entities that require.
Now, I do want to talk about, you've done some documentaries. One of them I especially want to touch on is The Boys, the Sherman Brothers story, because this is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. I love this documentary, and I want to know how you got involved with it. Obviously, you have a great admiration for the Sherman Brothers. You talked about Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, etc. But how did you get involved with this one?
Well, I said earlier my record albums were 3 Sherman Brothers soundtracks when I was growing up. And they were my music because they told me stories that I understood and that felt right and that I related to. The age of not believing in Bedknobs and Broomsticks was what I was feeling at the time that I heard it. That my childhood was ending, and I was afraid because I didn't believe in things anymore the way that, and adulthood was a scary proposition. The river song in Tom Sawyer was me at the age of 12. The world turns around and the boy grows tall. He hears the song of the river call. So their music had enormous meaning to me. And then, of course, finding out later, so much of the stuff that I heard in Disney films and on the other records that I had was written by the Sherman Brothers. I was a huge, huge fan. I often say that the 3 major adult male influences in my childhood were Walt and Dick and Bob. because I lived in a sort of absentee parent environment that was emotionally barren, and I was a weird kid who liked staying in his room and listening to records and reading books and collecting comics. And, I didn't go to Little League, and I didn't care about stuff that a lot of kids care about.
Yeah.
So I was a weirdo anyway. Ultimately, in my, I think, second week of my first actual paid job at Disney, I worked on the studio lot. This would have been 1986. I was coming in from the parking lot, and Dick and Bob were coming out together from the studio. And it was like if the Beatles had walked out.
Yeah.
I don't know, Marlon Brando. I was like, my heart stopped. So I riled up my courage, and I went up and I said, "Hey, you guys are the Sherman Brothers, aren't you?" And Bob looked at me and said, "They were not used to being recognized." Once again, remember the pre-internet, pre-video days. A couple of songwriters would not get recognized in public.
Sure.
Clearly, they were delighted that I knew who they were. But Bob looked at me and said, "Yeah, we are. Who are you?" So I started talking to them. I introduced myself, and I had actually just seen Tom Sawyer again. And I was fascinated because I had forgotten that they also wrote the screenplay and not just the songs. So I talked to them and was asking about their methodology for writing the screenplay. And I said, I noticed the resemblance that the screenplay has to solving the structural problems of the Mary Poppins adaptation. And went in and talked about, basically, nobody loves it more than when you want to talk about their work.
Sure.
And of course, I was fascinated, and we stood for half an hour in the parking lot talking about Tom Sawyer, basically. I said, "I've got to go. I'm sure you've got to go." We parted ways after half an hour. A couple of weeks after that, I was going into the front doors at Walt Disney Imagineering. Dick and Bob were coming out. "Hey, it's our Tom Sawyer guy." And Bob says, "Hiya, Jeff." And we stood and talked for another half an hour. At the end of that meeting, Bob took out of his wallet a card that said Sherbro Music, and it had an address in West Hollywood and a phone number. And he said, "Why don't you come over and visit, and we can talk some more about this stuff."
Wow.
So I started going and staying in touch with Dick and Bob. My work at the company got me more. It was interesting because at that time in the late 80s, Dick and Bob, the Sherman Brothers, they are so old-fashioned. They are so passé. Alan Menken tells this great story about going with Howard Ashman the first time to the studio, and the guy in the music department going, yeah, I want to talk to you guys about this project. I've got the Sherman Brothers down the hall in another office, but they're just so. There was this perception that Dick and Bob were the old school, and it's funny because the last time I talked to Alan about that, Alan said, "It's funny. Now Kristen and Bobby are like I was, and I'm the old guy down the hall." But I spent a lot of time and effort to keep them in the bloodstream because I was doing lots of things that had to do with employee events and openings and press events. So, if there was a press event at Disneyland and they wanted media people, I would say, you know what, Dick and Bob Sherman are around and they worked with Walt and blah, blah, blah. And, so I tried to spend a lot of time keeping them in the bloodstream of currency at Disney in the late 80s and into the early 90s. It was at that time that we spoke at length. They had done a pitch for a book called Walt's Time that they couldn't sell, but it was about how they came to be the Sherman Brothers of Disney fame. And nobody wanted it because it wasn't salacious. It was a love letter to Walt. It didn't say that he, walked around the office with no pants or, beat puppies with a stick or any of the things that people want in their celebrity bios. We want to knock people off the pedestal. So I said, why don't we take another go at it? And we wound up collaborating and developing a book that came out that was called Walt's Time, From Before to Beyond. And Dick and Bob and I became closer, and I got to know their families and their wives and their kids. And Bob actually dubbed me their official Shermanologist.
Oh, wow.
So I got a Sherman Brothers word coined in my behalf. I'm the Shermanologist.
There
And,
you go.
I would help answer letters and field requests from inside the company. And, Dick or Bob would call and say, what is this? Is this something we should be doing? Can you help us figure, I was that kind of liaison and help to them. And we became, we did become like an extended family. I have right here at my left hand, I have a note that Bob wrote me in 2010 from his house in London. That's just an inspiration to me about keep doing what you're doing and keep telling stories. And it inspires me every day as I sit down to work that I had that in my life. So when Greg and Jeff got together and decided to do a documentary film about their dads, both of them said, well, the guy you want to talk to is Jeff Kurtti. And so I came and met with Jeff and Greg and just talked to them about what accesses they would need and how to source still photography and artwork and who to interview and, help them develop the interview lists and very often the questions. There's some of the people that I knew that I reached out on their behalf, on behalf of the project, and did a lot of the photo research, artwork, brought in a ton of my own collection of albums and CDs and stuff to pull audio and video from and so on. So that was really my utility role. And I consistently sort of watched as it developed. I got in trouble at one point for delivering a critique about a cut of the film at a certain point in time and got my hand slapped a little bit. But, well, there's always conflict in creativity, I think. But then ultimately was made a co-producer on the film. And, I have a Disney movie poster that has my name on it. And how cool is that?
Yeah, and I think that documentary did a really incredible job of introducing the Sherman Brothers to a whole generation. And a funny story, this is 100% true. I saw the movie at the El Capitan Theater when it did, like a limited run sort of thing.
Yep.
And I saw it, and like a week later, my friend was traveling through town with a production of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Uh-huh.
And so I went to the theater to see Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and I turned to my friend and I say, how cool would it be if Dick Sherman just sat right in front of us? And I kid you not, 5 minutes later, that's what happened.
Uh-huh.
And I introduced myself, and I've met him. I've had lunch with him before and had great conversations with him, and I just absolutely love Dick Sherman. But I'm like, how insane is that? Like, I literally just saw your documentary and then saw one of your shows a week later and was like, wouldn't that be cool if he was here? And then he shows up. I'm like, bless you, Dick Sherman. You're amazing.
I have a longtime friend who says that coincidence is God wishing to remain anonymous.
Yeah.
And I've always sort of lived by that because I've had so many full circles and so many coincidences in my life.
Yeah.
That I have to somehow believe in some sort of higher power.
Yeah.
Because I have an uncle who says, how did a neglected 10-year-old from the suburbs of Seattle wind up, being friends with Walt Disney's daughter and grandkids and the Academy Award-winning songwriters of Mary Poppins and writing 40 books about Disney? How did that happen? And there's a certain part of you that has to go, well, coincidence? With a capital C? I don't know.
Yeah, it's this industry, as crazy and insane as it is, there's a lot of pinch me moments where, even just the conversations I get to have with people on the podcast, I end up in circumstances that I'm just like, how my 10-year-old self is freaking out right now.
And I think it's because you and people like you, and certainly me, have the ability. They say, oh, the little boy that won't grow up. But I always think that that's an emotionally sort of connected, it's like the arrested adolescent, the little boy who won't grow up. But we always have that part of us that lives with us constantly, that reminds us, be humble, be grateful, appreciate this. And I think that's why we have the demeanor and we have the ability to have the ease of conversation that you and I are having. For instance, because we're part of the same tribe.
I like that.
And I think that's a big part of the Disney thing. It's all very tribal. It's where we look across the campfire and go, "Oh, you're one of me too."
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I especially felt that way during the early days. I know you've been a speaker and presenter and stuff at the D23 Expo, and I've been to literally every single day of every single expo in Anaheim, day one charter member of D23. And the first few D23 Expos, I really felt exactly what you're talking about. That whole we're the same tribe sort of thing. I will say in more recent years, with the inclusion of Marvel and Lucasfilm and all these other things that are now part of the Walt Disney Company, the tribes have split, I feel like, in certain areas. And I cherish those days of, the first few D23 Expos, because it was really remarkable. You could turn to anybody in that convention center and immediately connect. And I just thought that was phenomenal.
I worry sometimes that Disney's acquisition and incorporation into their corporate structure of these other brand silos of Marvel and Lucas. Pixar is even sort of its own offshoot brand silo. I worry that there are Disney fans who feel an obligation to those other established cultures. That, oh boy, if I'm going to be a Disney fan, now I have to know all of this stuff. Or I have to, I don't like Marvel movies, but I'm a Disney fan, so I have to.
I do not feel that way.
Well, but I know you don't. I don't. I'm very fortunate in that I kind of do like all of the different brand silos at Disney. I'm not as nuts about them as I am about the pure Disney.
Sure.
But I worry that fans feel obligated somehow. And if there's anyone listening to your podcast who thinks, gee, I better know all my Marvel movies if I'm going to be a Disney fan, nah, you don't have to.
I completely agree with you. And I want to respect your time, so I'm going to wrap up with a couple of questions here, because we could literally talk forever. And perhaps you'll need to come back sometime, because there's so much we haven't even touched if you would like.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. Absolutely.
But I do want to ask, since we're talking about the Sherman Brothers documentary, and I don't need a detailed answer here, because to respect their privacy and stuff, but there was one thing with that documentary that I felt like it never answered the question of what exactly the rift was between them. And I'm just curious if you know what it was.
Absolutely.
Oh, you do know.
It's in the film. If you watch now watch the film again.
I've seen it many times.
There's a moment, it's probably in the first 15 minutes or so, where I think Jeff Sherman is asking, what were you guys like as kids? And Dick says, well, Bob was my hero. We were best friends.
Yeah.
And Bob says, I didn't know him. We were, something like we were so far apart in age, or,
Yes.
What you have is a very nuanced story in there about the relationship between two brothers who formed a partnership professionally and creatively that generated so much emotional purity and symmetry that I think we want their story to have both the symmetry of emotion and the heartfelt resolution. And that just is not part of their story. A.J. Carruthers, at one point on screen, he said, the fundamental issue is Robert is romantic and Richard is a sentimentalist. They're very different people, and we expect a kind of closeness between siblings sometimes that's not logical. Part of the reason that Dick and Bob's work is so spectacular is because of the core differences between Dick and Bob. Dick is ever the showman, extraordinarily talented, a composer. They were both so musically gifted. Bob was a deep thinker and very soulful, and very much the soul of a poet. He was portrayed to a lot of people as, oh, he's the gruff one, he's the crabby one. Well, Bob had a lot on his shoulders based on his background of experience, and he also measured very carefully what he said. so that when he had something to say, you really leaned in and listened to Bob Sherman. Dick was the consummate entertainer. He wanted people to enjoy themselves. He wanted people to be happy. Now, put that combination together as a songwriting team and you have genius. You have delightful songs that have heart and depth and spirit. Put two men together who are built that differently. You know what? They're going to lay by the pool and have a beer and talk about mom and dad and their kids and stuff. But I don't think, far from a rift between them or some sort of rancor or hostility, they were just two different guys. The other core thing I think you can glean from the film itself is a quote from Bob Osborne, where he brings up an anecdote. I think he talks about it, dates back to Abbott and Costello and to Martin and Lewis. Don't introduce the wives.
Yeah, yes.
And without going too deep into that, that was a core piece of the problem.
Yeah, there's definitely this mention of a moment about, I can't even remember the specifics, but one of them going to the other's house to collect some personal belongings. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to really affect the relationship in some way, shape, or form. And it never got into details, and honestly, it just broke my heart to watch even the question be asked of the brothers, because Dick especially didn't want to talk about it, because even X amount of years later, it was still such an open wound for him, and it's heartbreaking.
And to be honest, for both of them.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where there was an incidental occurrence that simply, I think, to be honest, it was simply an event blown out of proportion, and there was a lot of blame back and forth for crises within families.
Sure.
It's not my place to talk about the Sherman's family issues. I think the only thing, if you want to see what the Sherman boys meant to each other, is that moment in the film where Dick reads the poem that Bob wrote to him, I think, on his 50th birthday.
Yes, yes.
You don't need to know anything else about their relationship. That was it. Those two loved each other. They respected each other. They created a body of work that will continue to influence popular culture on Earth for centuries. And that's what you need to know mostly about the Sherman Brothers, to be honest. But if you look at that scene where Dick reads that glorious poetic tribute from an older brother to his younger brother, that's the story of Dick and Bob Sherman right there.
Yeah, it's truly a phenomenal documentary, and I tell anybody, if they're like, hey, I want to know, can you suggest any Disney history documentaries? I always mention the Sherman Brothers, and I mentioned another one that you worked on, I believe as a consultant, Waking Sleeping Beauty. That's the other one that it's just so wonderfully put together and so honest, and that's what I love about both of them, and it's interesting because they both came out around the same time.
Dick Cook, who was the chairman of the studio at the time, was very interested in documenting a lot of the Disney culture. So he greenlighted a lot of these things and said, I know they're not going to make any money, but maybe they'll win awards and they'll be evergreen. We'll pull them off the shelf for decades to come. Yeah. And it was that way with Frank and Ollie and Walt and El Grupo and Waking Sleeping Beauty and with the boys. There's a lot of wonderful documentary work that came out during that period. And of course, I always, it's unfortunate because a lot of it is sort of lost in limbo now, but we did a lot of great retrospective documentary stuff on those first DVDs and on the Walt Disney Treasures series that I co-produced and co-created with Leonard Maltin.
Are those the tin cases you're talking about?
Uh-huh.
Yes, I have several of those, and I love them, and I watch them pretty regularly. Like they're just they're treasure chests of information, and I love them. So thank you. I'm going to ask you one last thing before we go, just because I know nothing about this, and this has to do with a touring exhibit called The Dream of Walt Disney in Japan. What was this? How did this come about? And what was your involvement?
I get called on once again. In a lot of cases, it's just because I know what stuff is and I know where it came from and I know how to get it. So for instance, people who don't have a lot of deep Disney knowledge will go, I want that footage of Walt singing Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow with Dick and Bob Sherman for this concert I'm doing in Japan. And I'll say, okay, I know what that is. I know what the inventory code is. And it's called the, GE Management Conference Film, and it's from 1963 and blah, blah, blah. And I know everybody in the vaults and the collections and so on. So I get hired a lot to do that, to either curate or help create storylines. I'm actually just been called into another one. Japan, of course, very, very big Disney fan base there. So they do a D23 convention in Japan, and I've done a couple of consulting gigs on those. And then the exhibit, the one that you mentioned, it's hard to, I think I wrote, produced, and delivered, I think 12 video components that were on monitors as you walked throughout the exhibit. I never saw the exhibit myself.
Was it like an archives exhibit sort of thing?
It was sort of supervised by the Walt Disney Archives in terms of content and assets. And it was put together, I think, by Walt Disney Attractions Japan or Walt Disney Company Japan office.
Okay.
But they do a lot of those kinds of things. Like I said, this last fall, I did a concert. They wanted to do one of those sort of Hollywood Bowl concerts where they throw film clips up on a big screen and do montages with symphonic arrangements of different medleys of music.
Sure.
So I secured all of their film footage and helped them understand the music clearances. A lot of times, our clearances and rights and stuff are very specific with Disney material. I know that stuff because I've had to do it.
Fantastic. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. The wealth of knowledge you have and the credits you have are absolutely amazing. I would love to have you back sometime to talk even more, because I feel like we could go on for like 6 hours if we wanted right now.
I'm always happy to talk about this stuff, and particularly to address more broader bases of fans. And it's kind of why I do what I do. Every time I do a book, for instance, I think there's going to be a 65-year-old grouch who's going to send me a note with every typo and perceived factual error. But there's going to be a 12-year-old kid who takes this book home and carries it around like a puppy. And it's going to be their gateway into Disney.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I have quite a few of your books on my shelf, unbeknownst to me.
I'm glad to know it, but that's why I do it, to tell you the truth, because I was the 12-year-old kid carrying around my first edition of Christopher Finch's Art of Walt Disney that I got my only Christmas present in 1972, or whenever that was, because it was so expensive.
Yeah.
The only thing I got for Christmas. But that's, to me, is what the legacy is about. Is it's not going to last if you don't bring people into it and make them passionate about it and interested in it. So any time you want to talk again, just let me know.
Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I hope you all enjoyed my interview with Jeff, and don't forget to visit DisneyCoastToCoast.com/exclusive to hear even more special interviews. If you missed this past Wednesday's episode, be sure to check it out as I chatted with the editor and writer for the Imagineering story, and don't forget that you can hear the latest Disney news every Sunday and the House of Mouse headlines. The easiest way to make sure you don't miss any of the magic is by making sure you're subscribed to Disney Coast to Coast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Wherever you search, don't forget, it's Disney with a Z, coast to coast. And folks, don't forget that you can gain early access to episodes of Disney Coast to Coast, join me for live stream Q&As, and gain other rewards over at patreon.com/DisneyCTC. If you haven't taken the time to check it out yet, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment and do just that. Head on over to patreon.com/DisneyCTC to see how you can gain rewards and help support the show at the same time. That's patreon.com/DisneyCTC. patreon.com/DIZNEYCTC. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!
Thanks for listening to Disney Coast to Coast. Have a magical day.
Disney Coast to Coast is produced and hosted by Jeff DePauli. Learn more about the podcast and become a supporter at DisneyCoastToCoast.com.